Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty, watching the strange alien ships approach through the vast darkness of space. The vessels looked nothing like human ships, with their smooth, curved surfaces that seemed to bend light. Around them, they moved without any visible engines, yet traveled faster than anything humanity had ever built. Jake felt his heart beating faster as he realized this moment would change everything for the human race. The diplomatic meeting was supposed to happen on Kepler 442b, a small moon that both sides had agreed was neutral territory. For months, Earth's scientists had worked to prepare for this first contact with an alien civilization. They had practiced different greeting rituals, prepared translation devices, and chosen their best diplomats for the mission. Dr. Amanda White was the lead cultural expert, and she had spent countless hours studying the few signals they had received from the aliens who called themselves Zephyrians. Jake had been chosen to command the escort mission, not because he was the best diplomat, but because he was one of the few captains who had never lost a ship in combat. The Earth government wanted someone reliable to protect their diplomatic team. He never imagined he would become the center of an interstellar war. The Zephyrian ships were beautiful in a way that made human technology look primitive. As they descended toward the moon's surface, Jake could see their hulls shifting colors like oil on water. The largest ship was clearly meant for their leader, someone the intercepted communications had identified as Queen Liara. Intelligence reports suggested she was the absolute ruler of an empire that spanned dozens of star systems. The meeting took place in a specially built dome on the moon's surface. The structure was half human design and half based on Zephyrian specifications that had been transmitted ahead of the meeting. Jake stood guard with his security team, while Dr. White and the other diplomats prepared for first contact with beings from another world. When Queen Liara entered the dome, Jake's breath caught in his throat. She was 7 feet tall with skin that looked like living crystal. Her features were almost human, but stretched and refined in ways that made her appear both beautiful and terrifying. Her eyes were large and completely black, and when she moved, her skin shifted through different shades of blue and silver. She wore robes that seemed to be made of the same material as her ships, flowing and changing color with each step. The queen brought with her a delegation of other Zephyrians, all tall and elegant, with the same crystalline skin. They moved with perfect coordination, as if they shared a single mind. Jake noticed that they all wore intricate jewelry that pulsed with soft light. Later, he would learn these were not just decorations, but sophisticated communication devices. Dr. White began the carefully rehearsed greeting ceremony. She had studied every scrap of information about Zephyrian culture that human scientists had been able to gather. The aliens had sent some cultural data along with their request for a meeting, though much of it was difficult to understand. The translation software worked reasonably well for basic communication, but missed many nuances. Everything was going smoothly until Dr. White noticed a beautiful crystal sculpture on the table that the Zephyrians had brought as a gift. It looked like a miniature star system with tiny planets orbiting a central glowing orb. Without thinking, she reached out and touched the central crystal, admiring its craftsmanship. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Every Zephyrian in the room went completely still. Their skin shifted to a deep red color that Jake somehow knew meant danger. Queen Liara stepped forward and spoke in a voice that sounded like music and breaking glass at the same time. The translation device struggled with her words, but the meaning was clear enough. Dr. White had just committed an act that the Zephyrians considered a declaration of war. Jake tried to step between the aliens and the human delegation. But Queen Liara raised her hand, and he found himself unable to move. She spoke again, her words carrying a weight that made the air itself seem heavy. She was explaining that by touching the sacred crystal, Dr. White had triggered an ancient ritual that could only end in battle or death. Dr. White tried desperately to explain that it was a mistake, that humans meant no offense. But the Queen's expression never changed. The Zephyrians began to file out of the dome with the same perfect coordination they had shown when entering. Queen Liara was the last to leave, and before she stepped through the doorway, she looked directly at Jake. For a moment their eyes met, and he saw something in her alien gaze that he couldn't identify. Then she was gone. Within hours, the war began. Jake received emergency communications from Earth reporting that 3 outer colonies had been attacked. The Zephyrian ships had appeared without warning and destroyed everything in their path. Millions of people were dead or missing. The attacks were surgical and precise, targeting military installations and government buildings while leaving civilian areas mostly untouched. It was clear that this was not random destruction, but a calculated military campaign. Jake's orders came directly from Admiral Charles Grant, the head of Earth's Space Forces. The UES Liberty was to return immediately to join the defense of the inner colonies. As they traveled back toward Earth, Jake received more reports of Zephyrian attacks. Each message painted a bleaker picture of humanity's chances in this war. The enemy ships could appear and disappear at will, strike with weapons that turned matter into energy, and seemed completely immune to human weapons. In the first week of fighting, humanity lost 37 ships and gained nothing. Not a single Zephyrian vessel had been damaged in any reported engagement. Jake found himself thinking about Queen Liara's expression as she left the dome. There had been something in her alien eyes that bothered him, something that didn't match the destruction her forces were unleashing across human space. He couldn't shake the feeling that this war was not what it appeared to be, that there was something about the Zephyrians that humanity didn't understand. As the UES Liberty approached Earth, Jake could see the orbital defense platforms that had been hastily constructed since the war began. They looked pathetic compared to what he had seen of Zephyrian technology. He realized that unless something changed dramatically, the human race was facing extinction at the hands of beings they had tried to greet in peace. 6 months had passed since the first Zephyrian attack, and Jake Morrison barely recognized the galaxy around him. Half of human space was now under alien control, and refugees filled every remaining colony ship and space station. The UES Liberty had become more than a warship. It was a symbol of human resistance that somehow kept fighting when every battle should have been their last. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Brooks coordinated the endless stream of evacuation ships from her position at the communications station. Her voice had become a lifeline for thousands of families fleeing the advancing Zephyrian forces. Every day brought new reports of colonies falling and civilians needing rescue. The aliens never targeted refugee ships directly, which puzzled human military analysts who couldn't understand why such an advanced enemy would show any mercy. Jake stood in the Liberty's war room studying holographic displays that showed the current state of the conflict. Red zones marked Zephyrian-controlled territory, while blue areas represented the shrinking human-held space. The pattern was strange because the alien advance seemed deliberately slow and methodical, rather than the crushing assault that their superior technology could have delivered. Dr. Patricia Hayes had spent months studying every piece of Zephyrian technology they could salvage from battle sites. Her laboratory aboard the Liberty was filled with fragments of alien hull material, weapon components, and communication devices. Most of it was beyond human understanding, but she had made some interesting discoveries about Zephyrian society and biology. The aliens operated under a rigid hierarchy with Queen Liara at the absolute top. Every decision, from large military campaigns to small tactical moves, required her direct approval. This explained why Zephyrian forces sometimes paused their attacks for days at a time, apparently waiting for orders from their distant leader. Dr. Hayes had also learned that Zephyrian biology was silicon-based rather than carbon-based like humans, which explained their crystalline appearance and their ability to interface directly with their technology. Jake had encountered Queen Liara face-to-face several times during prisoner exchanges and temporary ceasefires. These meetings were always tense affairs held on neutral space stations or uninhabited planets. The Queen would arrive with a small escort while Jake represented the human military leadership. They would exchange captured personnel and discuss terms for brief truces to allow civilian evacuations. During these encounters, Jake noticed that Queen Liara always seemed to be studying him. Her large black eyes would track his movements and expressions as if she was trying to solve some complex puzzle. She rarely spoke during the formal negotiations, leaving most of the talking to her subordinates, but when she did speak, her words carried absolute authority. The Queen stood 7 feet tall, and her crystalline skin shifted colors to reflect her emotions, though Jake was only beginning to understand what the different hues meant. Blue seemed to indicate calm attention, while silver suggested deep thought. Red was clearly anger or aggression, as they had learned during that first disastrous diplomatic meeting. There were other colors, too, subtle shades that appeared when she looked at Jake directly, but he couldn't decode their meaning. Engineer Tony Rodriguez worked 18-hour days trying to reverse engineer captured Zephyrian technology. His workshop was filled with alien devices that defied human understanding of physics. Some components seemed to manipulate gravity, while others affected time itself in small but measurable ways. Every breakthrough only revealed how far behind humanity truly was in the galactic community. The most frustrating discovery was that Zephyrian weapons and shields operated on principles that human science couldn't even properly describe. Their energy sources were impossibly efficient, and their materials were stronger than anything in human industry. Tony's team had managed to create crude copies of some simpler devices, but nothing that could match alien capabilities in actual combat. Communications officer Rachel Murphy had become expert at intercepting and partially decoding Zephyrian transmissions. The aliens used quantum-encrypted channels that should have been impossible to break, but Rachel had discovered that their communication network sometimes leaked unencrypted status updates. These fragments painted a picture of an empire that was not entirely united in its approach to the human war. Some Zephyrian commanders seemed eager to end the conflict quickly with overwhelming force. Others appeared to advocate for the current, gradual approach. Most interesting were references to debates within the royal court about the ultimate fate of humanity. The aliens were clearly capable of exterminating every human in the galaxy within weeks, yet they continued this slow, methodical campaign that gave humans time to evacuate and regroup. Jake found himself in command of increasingly desperate military operations. Human tactics had evolved to focus on hit-and-run attacks rather than direct confrontation. They would strike isolated Zephyrian outposts or supply lines, then retreat before the aliens could respond with overwhelming force. These raids rarely caused significant damage, but they kept human forces active and maintained some hope among the civilian population. The Battle of Titan's Edge had been Jake's most significant encounter with Zephyrian forces. 12 human ships had engaged a small alien patrol fleet in what should have been a routine skirmish. Within minutes, 11 human vessels were destroyed by weapons that seemed to unravel matter at the atomic level. The UES Liberty survived only because Jake had positioned his ship behind a large asteroid when the Zephyrian counterattack began. During that battle, Jake had watched helplessly as thousands of his fellow humans died in brilliant flashes of light. The Zephyrian weapons didn't just destroy ships, they completely erased them from existence, leaving no debris or wreckage behind. It was the kind of technology that made human resistance seem pointless. Yet the aliens continued to use measured force rather than deploying these ultimate weapons against major human population centers. The mystery deepened when Dr. Hayes made a crucial discovery about Zephyrian culture. Hidden in their intercepted communications were references to ancient protocols for ending conflicts without total destruction. The aliens had specific rituals and traditions for integrating conquered species into their empire rather than exterminating them. This suggested that Queen Liara might have plans for humanity beyond simple military defeat. Jake began to suspect that the entire war was some kind of test. The Zephyrians were clearly evaluating human responses to different types of pressure. They would attack military targets to gauge human tactical abilities, then allow evacuations to observe human compassion and organizational skills. They would offer prisoner exchanges to study human diplomatic behavior, then launch surprise raids to test human adaptability under stress. The idea that millions of human deaths might be part of an alien evaluation process was horrifying, but it was the only explanation that made sense of Zephyrian behavior. Queen Liara was studying humanity the same way a scientist might study a new species of bacteria, applying different stimuli to observe the results. As Jake stood on the Liberty's bridge watching another evacuation convoy flee toward the inner colonies, he wondered what the Queen had learned about humans and what she planned to do with that knowledge. The war was entering a new phase, and something told him that Queen Liara was preparing to reveal her true intentions for the human race. The negotiation chamber on New Geneva was unlike anything Jake Morrison had ever seen. The disputed planet sat at the border between human and Zephyrian space, and both sides had agreed to meet here for what everyone hoped would be decisive peace talks. The building itself was a marvel of cooperation between the two species, with human architectural elements blended seamlessly with Zephyrian crystal technology that made the walls glow with soft blue light. Jake sat across from Queen Liara, at a circular table that seemed to be carved from a single massive gem. Admiral Charles Grant was beside him, along with Dr. Amanda White and the rest of Earth's diplomatic team. The Queen had brought her usual escort of tall, crystalline beings who stood perfectly still along the chamber walls. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as both sides prepared for negotiations that could determine the fate of humanity. For the first hour, the talks followed predictable patterns. Admiral Grant presented humanity's position, requesting an end to hostilities and the return of occupied colonies. The Zephyrian representatives countered with demands for human submission to imperial authority and the acceptance of alien oversight of human government. Jake watched Queen Liara during these exchanges and noticed that she seemed distracted. Her attention focused more on him than on the formal proceedings. Dr. White tried to find middle ground by proposing various forms of limited cooperation between the species. She suggested joint scientific research programs, cultural exchange initiatives, and shared governance of disputed territories. The Zephyrian delegates listened politely but offered no encouraging responses. Jake began to fear that these talks would end like all the previous attempts at peace, with both sides returning to their ships to continue a war that humanity could not win. Then Queen Liara stood up, and the entire chamber fell silent. When she spoke, her voice carried the musical quality that Jake had learned to associate with important Zephyrian pronouncements. The translation devices worked quickly to convert her words into human language, but Jake found himself watching her expressions and gestures as much as listening to her words. The Queen began by acknowledging the courage and resilience that humans had shown during the war. She spoke of battles where human forces had fought against impossible odds, and civilian evacuations that had saved millions of lives despite overwhelming enemy superiority. Jake felt a strange mix of pride and confusion as this alien ruler praised the very people she had been systematically conquering. Then Queen Liara's skin shifted to a color Jake had never seen before, a deep purple that seemed to pulse with inner light. She looked directly at him as she continued speaking, and her next words changed everything Jake thought he knew about the war and his own future. The Queen announced that the conflict could end immediately under one specific condition. Captain Jake Morrison must agree to become her consort and rule beside her as king of the Zephyrian Empire. The war would stop, human colonies would be returned to human control, and both species would unite under joint leadership to face greater threats in the galaxy. The silence that followed was absolute. Jake felt as if the air had been sucked out of the chamber as every human in the room stared at him in shock. Admiral Grant's face had gone completely white while Dr. White frantically consulted her cultural reference materials. The Zephyrian delegates showed no surprise, suggesting that they had known about their queen's intentions in advance. Jake's initial reaction was complete rejection of what seemed like an impossible and absurd proposal. How could he trust an alien who had spent months destroying human settlements and killing his people? The idea of marrying someone from another species was strange enough, but marrying the leader of an enemy empire seemed like madness or an elaborate trap. But as the shock began to wear off, Jake noticed that Queen Liara's expression had changed. Her crystalline features showed something that looked remarkably like vulnerability. Her skin had shifted to a pale blue color that Dr. Hayes had identified as indicating uncertainty or emotional stress. For the first time since he had met her, the powerful alien ruler looked almost fragile. Dr. White quickly began consulting her research about Zephyrian customs and marriage traditions. What she discovered made everyone in the chamber realize that Queen Liara's proposal was far more significant than a simple political alliance. In Zephyrian culture, a ruling queen could only take a consort under their most sacred laws, and such a union would create an unbreakable bond between their civilizations. The Queen explained that she had been studying human culture throughout the war and had become fascinated by humanity's capacity for growth under pressure. She admitted that the conflict had been partly a test to evaluate whether humans were worthy of partnership rather than simple conquest. Human creativity, adaptability, and compassion had impressed her in ways that she had not expected. Queen. Liara revealed that traditional Zephyrian society was rigidly hierarchical with absolute power concentrated in the hands of the ruling class. She had observed human concepts of cooperation and shared decision-making with growing interest. The idea of ruling alongside an equal partner was revolutionary in Zephyrian culture, and many of her own advisors had opposed her decision to make this proposal. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Brooks, who had been monitoring communications during the meeting, reported that Zephyrian military forces throughout the galaxy had stopped all offensive operations immediately after the Queen's announcement. This was not a negotiating tactic or a temporary ceasefire. It was a complete halt to the war pending Jake's response to the marriage proposal. Admiral Grant requested a recess to allow the human delegation to discuss this unprecedented situation. As they huddled in a side chamber, arguments broke out immediately about how to respond. Some saw the proposal as humanity's only chance for survival, while others viewed it as the ultimate betrayal of human independence. Dr. White's analysis of Zephyrian law revealed that if Queen Liara's proposal was rejected, she would be required by ancient tradition to end the war through total victory rather than negotiation. The Queen had risked her own position and possibly her life by making this offer. If Jake refused, she would have no choice but to complete the conquest of human space to maintain her authority among her own people. Jake found himself facing a decision that no human had ever confronted: accept marriage to an alien queen and potentially save his species, or reject the proposal and watch humanity face inevitable extinction. The weight of billions of lives rested on his shoulders, and he had to choose between his personal freedom and the survival of everyone he had ever known. As the recess continued, Jake realized that Queen Liara had been planning this moment for months. Every battle, every prisoner exchange, every temporary ceasefire had been designed to bring them to this point. She had been studying him as carefully as she had been studying human culture, evaluating whether he could be the partner she needed to transform both of their civilizations. The Queen's proposal was not just about ending the war. It was about creating something entirely new in the galaxy, a union between two very different species that could combine human innovation with Zephyrian technology, human compassion with alien efficiency, human adaptability with crystalline permanence. Jake looked through the chamber window at Queen Liara, who sat motionless at the negotiating table while her delegates waited patiently for his decision. Her alien beauty was undeniable, but more than that, he was beginning to see the loneliness and burden of absolute power that she carried. For the first time, he wondered what it would be like to share that burden and help guide two civilizations toward an uncertain but potentially magnificent future. Jake Morrison had never felt the weight of responsibility more heavily than in the days following Queen Liara's proposal. He walked the corridors of the UES Liberty, knowing that every crew member was watching him, wondering what decision he would make that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the entire human race. The ship felt different now, as if the very air was charged with tension and unspoken questions. His senior staff was deeply divided about the Queen's offer. Chief Medical Officer Susan Taylor had spent hours reviewing everything they knew about Zephyrian biology and culture. She argued that the proposal represented humanity's best and possibly only chance for survival. The aliens had demonstrated that they could destroy human civilization whenever they chose, so cooperation might be the only path forward that didn't end in extinction. Susan had also pointed out that Queen Liara's behavior throughout the war suggested she was not the typical conquering alien ruler. The Queen had shown restraint in targeting civilian populations, had honored all ceasefire agreements, and had treated human prisoners according to what appeared to be strict ethical guidelines. These actions indicated that she might genuinely want partnership rather than domination. Navigation Officer Carl Johnson disagreed strongly with Susan's assessment. He believed that accepting the Queen's proposal would be the ultimate surrender of human independence. Carl argued that even if humanity survived as a species, they would lose everything that made them human by submitting to alien rule. He preferred to fight to the end rather than give up their freedom to an alien empire, no matter how benevolent it might appear. The debate had spread throughout the ship and beyond to the remaining human colonies. Some people saw Jake as humanity's potential savior, while others viewed him as a traitor who was considering selling out his own species for personal power. The pressure was enormous, and Jake found himself unable to sleep as he wrestled with the impossible choice. Meanwhile, Earth's Global Council was engaged in equally heated discussions. The emergency session had been going on for 3 days with no consensus emerging. Counselor Helen Foster led the faction that supported accepting the Queen's proposal. She argued that humanity had always survived by adapting to new circumstances, and that this situation, while unprecedented, was simply the next step in human evolution. Helen pointed out that access to Zephyrian technology could advance human civilization by centuries almost overnight. Medical advances alone could eliminate most diseases and extend human lifespan dramatically. Space travel technology could open up vast new areas of the galaxy for exploration and colonization. The benefits of alliance with such an advanced civilization were almost impossible to calculate. Defense Minister Paul Carter represented the opposition to the marriage proposal. He insisted that accepting alien rule would mean the end of human culture and identity. Paul argued that freedom was more valuable than survival and that humanity should fight on regardless of the odds. He believed that even defeat in battle would be preferable to voluntary submission to an alien empire. The debates were complicated by the fact that nobody really understood Queen Liara's motivations or long-term plans. Dr. Patricia Hayes had continued studying intercepted Zephyrian communications and had discovered references to other alien civilizations that posed significant threats to both humans and Zephyrians. The Queen's warnings about greater dangers in the galaxy appeared to be genuine. Jake found himself spending more time with Queen Liara during extended ceasefire negotiations. The formal talks had been suspended while humanity considered the marriage proposal, but both leaders continued meeting to discuss practical matters like prisoner exchanges and humanitarian aid for displaced civilians. These conversations gave Jake opportunities to observe the Queen more closely and try to understand her true nature. To his surprise, Jake discovered that beneath Queen Liara's alien exterior was a being who struggled with loneliness and the burden of absolute power. She had ruled the Zephyrian Empire for over 2 centuries, making every major decision alone and bearing full responsibility for the welfare of trillions of subjects across dozens of star systems. The isolation of supreme leadership had clearly taken its toll on her. Queen Liara revealed that traditional Zephyrian culture emphasized individual achievement and hierarchical authority. The concept of shared leadership or partnership between equals was virtually unknown in her society. She had learned about human relationships and cooperation by studying captured human communications and observing prisoner interactions. The idea of having a partner to share decisions and responsibilities fascinated her in ways that she was still trying to understand. The Queen also shared disturbing intelligence about threats from other parts of the galaxy. She described a species called the Void Swarm that consumed entire star systems and left nothing behind but empty space. She spoke of machine intelligences that had wiped out their creators and now sought to eliminate all organic life. She mentioned energy beings that existed in higher dimensions and occasionally descended into normal space to harvest civilizations for unknown purposes. According to Queen Liara, the galaxy was far more dangerous than humanity realized. Earth's Location in a relatively isolated arm of the Milky Way had protected them from these threats so far, but expansion into wider galactic space would inevitably bring contact with hostile forces that made the Zephyrian Empire look friendly by comparison. A human-Zephyrian alliance might be necessary for both species to survive what was coming. As if to prove the Queen's point, attacks began on the outer edges of both human and Zephyrian territory. The attackers were unlike anything either species had encountered before. They appeared to be a mix of organic creatures and mechanical components, moving in perfect coordination and showing no interest in communication or negotiation. Their ships were dark and angular, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, and their weapons seemed to feed on the energy they destroyed. These new enemies, which intelligence services quickly labeled the Void Swarm, struck without warning and left no survivors. They targeted both human and Zephyrian installations with equal intensity, suggesting that they made no distinction between the two species. The attacks were small-scale so far, probably scouting missions, but they demonstrated capabilities that worried even Zephyrian military commanders. Jake realized that Queen Liara's proposal was taking on new urgency. The marriage might not just be about ending the human-Zephyrian war. It might be about creating an alliance strong enough to face threats that neither species could handle alone. The Queen's timing suddenly made perfect sense. She had been preparing for larger conflicts while testing humanity's worthiness as allies. The personal aspect of the decision was equally complex. Jake found himself genuinely intrigued by Queen Liara despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Her intelligence was obvious, and her dedication to her people was admirable. She was alien in ways that sometimes made communication difficult, but she was also curious about human perspectives and seemed genuinely interested in learning from partnership rather than simply imposing her will. The physical differences between their species were significant, but not insurmountable. Zephyrian physiology was silicon-based rather than carbon-based, but they were compatible enough for close interaction. Dr. Hayes had determined that while reproduction between the species was probably impossible, emotional and intellectual bonds could certainly develop. Jake's crew had noticed the change in his behavior as he spent more time considering the Queen's proposal. He was quieter than usual and spent long hours staring out at the stars as if looking for answers in the vast emptiness of space. The weight of choosing not just his own future, but the fate of humanity was unlike anything any person had ever faced. As reports of Void Swarm attacks continued to arrive, Jake realized that time was running out. Queen Liara had made it clear that her proposal had limits, and that Zephyrian law would eventually force her to complete the conquest of human space if the offer was rejected. The approaching threat from the Void Swarm made the need for a decision even more urgent. Jake stood in his quarters looking at a holographic display showing the current military situation. Human and Zephyrian forces were both being redeployed to face the new threat, but cooperation between the species was limited by the ongoing war. Only a formal alliance could unlock the combined potential needed to face what was coming from the dark spaces between the stars. Jake Morrison made his decision on a quiet morning as he watched the stars from his quarters aboard the UES Liberty. The weight of responsibility had not lessened, but clarity had finally come to him during the long, sleepless hours of the night. He would accept Queen Liara's proposal not just to save humanity, but because he had come to believe that she genuinely offered something unprecedented in galactic history, a true partnership between species that could benefit both civilizations. The announcement sent shockwaves throughout human space. Some colonies celebrated the end of the war, while others mourned what they saw as the end of human independence. Jake's crew was divided in their reactions, but they remained loyal to their captain even as they struggled to understand his choice. Chief Medical Officer Susan Taylor was openly supportive, while Navigation Officer Carl Johnson remained respectfully silent about his disapproval. The wedding ceremony was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. It took place aboard a specially constructed space station in neutral territory, a massive structure that blended human and Zephyrian architecture into something entirely new. The station's central chamber was large enough to hold representatives from both civilizations, with crystalline walls that caught and reflected light in patterns that seemed to pulse with life. Queen Liara arrived wearing robes that shifted through every color of the spectrum, her crystalline skin glowing with what Jake had learned was excitement and anticipation. She had explained that Zephyrian marriage ceremonies were rare events, as their queens traditionally ruled alone, so even her own people were witnessing something revolutionary. Jake wore a modified human dress uniform that had been enhanced with Zephyrian technology to allow him to interface with alien systems. The ceremony itself combined traditions from both cultures. Human vows of partnership and mutual support were blended with Zephyrian rituals of mental bonding and shared responsibility. When Jake and Queen Liara joined hands, her skin briefly matched the color of his, a Zephyrian sign of perfect harmony that amazed the alien witnesses. The moment they were declared married, all Zephyrian military forces throughout the galaxy received orders to stand down and begin withdrawal from human territory. The immediate aftermath of the wedding was chaotic, as both civilizations struggled to adapt to their new reality. Jake found himself with the title of King Morrison, a position that came with authority over Zephyrian military forces and civilian populations across dozens of star systems. The learning curve was steep as he tried to understand alien technology, culture, and governmental systems that had no human equivalent. Queen Liara proved to be a patient teacher and a surprisingly effective partner. She had spent months studying human leadership styles and was eager to experiment with concepts like democratic decision-making and distributed authority. Together they began implementing changes that shocked traditional Zephyrian society while opening new possibilities for both species. Dr. Patricia Hayes found herself leading joint human-Zephyrian research teams that made breakthrough discoveries almost daily. Access to alien science allowed human researchers to understand fundamental principles that had been mysteries for centuries. At the same time, human creativity and unconventional thinking sparked innovations that impressed even advanced Zephyrian scientists. The new alliance proved its worth quickly when the Void Swarm launched their first major invasion. The enemy fleet was massive, consisting of hundreds of dark angular ships that seemed to absorb light and energy from everything around them. Intelligence reports suggested that this was just the advance force of a much larger swarm that was moving through the galaxy, consuming entire civilizations. Jake found himself commanding combined fleets that would have been impossible under the old system. Human tactical flexibility merged with Zephyrian technological superiority created strategies that neither species could have developed alone. The battles were fierce and costly, but the Alliance forces were able to hold their ground and eventually push back the invaders. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Brooks, now promoted to captain of the UES Liberty, led one of the first mixed human Zephyrian crews in combat. The coordination challenges were enormous, as the two species had completely different command structures and communication methods, but the results were impressive. Human intuition combined with alien precision created a fighting force that was greater than the sum of its parts. Engineer Tony Rodriguez made history by successfully creating hybrid technologies that incorporated the best features of both civilizations. His workshops became centers of innovation, where human engineers worked alongside Zephyrian technicians to develop weapons, shields, and propulsion systems that neither species could have imagined independently. The integration was not without problems. Many humans struggled to accept their new alien partners, viewing them as conquerors despite the formal alliance. Some Zephyrians questioned their queen's decision to share power with what they considered a primitive species. Jake and Queen Liara spent countless hours mediating disputes and working to bridge cultural gaps that sometimes seemed impossible to cross. The most significant challenge was establishing a governmental system that respected both human concepts of individual rights and Zephyrian traditions of hierarchical authority. Jake and Queen Liara developed a hybrid approach that maintained the efficiency of alien administration while incorporating human ideas about representation and consent of the governed. Communication remained a constant obstacle as the two species thought about problems in fundamentally different ways. Humans tended to approach challenges through trial and error, while Zephyrians preferred comprehensive analysis before taking action. Learning to blend these approaches took patience and understanding from both sides. The threat from the Void Swarm continued to grow as intelligence reports revealed the true scope of their expansion through the galaxy. Entire star systems were disappearing behind expanding walls of darkness as the swarm consumed everything in its path. Other alien civilizations were falling one by one, unable to mount effective resistance against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every victory. Jake realized that the alliance between humans and Zephyrians might be just the beginning of what was needed to face this threat. Other species would need to join the coalition if there was any hope of stopping the swarm's advance. The marriage that had begun as an ultimatum to end a war was becoming the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization. Standing in the command center of their joint capital station, Jake and Queen Liara worked together to coordinate the defense of their combined territory. The screens around them showed the